Glad you could all join us this morning. I know that this is a rather unusual day to have an event like this, especially because most of our students are taking exams at the moment. So, and most of our faculty are grading exams. So, I want to thank both sides of the aisle for being here today. Well, last week, let me just introduce this one more time and say that, we at SIPA, the initiative by our Dean, John Stack, is to hold a series of these roundtables following President Fidel Castro's death now almost 2 weeks ago. And the idea was to sort of engage our faculty and engage our students in a conversation on the different ramifications of President Castro's passing, former President Castro, I should say. So last Friday, we began this series of discussions to examine the impact of Castro's death on Cuba, the impact on politics, the economy, and society in Cuba. And today, I'm pleased to introduce our faculty, and we'll be talking about the broader impact of the death of Fidel. But we want to also focus on the second part of this conversation, which is the death of Fidel and the coming to office of Donald Trump. What are the broad ramifications of that? What does this mean in terms of US Cuba relations? But also, what does it mean in terms of the relationship of the United States with Latin America, with the rest of the Caribbean, with the rest of the world? So I want to take this in part and try to break it down in its component parts. Before I do that, though, let me ask, as I have done in the past, rather than me introducing them, let me ask our panelists to give us a very brief, short introduction, because I know I'll mess it up. So let me start here with Dr. Moore.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Frank Moore. I'm the director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center and professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations.
Hi, my name is Danielle Cleveland. I am assistant professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations.
Good morning, everyone. I am Brian Fonseca. I am director of the Gordon Institute for Public Policy and adjunct faculty in both the Department of Politics and International Relations and the Kimberly Green Latin American Caribbean Center.
Great. And I'm Eduardo Gamarra. I'm also a professor in the Politics Department, and I've been here 31 years. I guess that's sometimes you want to admit that, and sometimes you don't. So I guess this is one of those times. So let me begin, and we're just going to have an informal conversation here, and I would like to get you all involved as well. So it is a seminar, so it is a conversation. So let me begin by asking a very broad question. Okay? What is the impact of Fidel's death on US Cuba relations specifically? Okay? Are things going to change dramatically? Can we expect something dramatic to happen, especially in January with the coming to office of President-elect Trump? So let me begin with Brian, and I want each of you to give me sort of a very, very brief beginning statement.
Okay, thank you, Eduardo. So in the policy context with respect to US-Cuba policy, I think in the immediate short-term, January, no, I don't expect President-elect Trump to assume office and immediately begin rolling back the opening of U.S. relations with Cuba under the Obama administration. I don't expect that's going to be the case. We may see some strong rhetoric, which we're already seeing, and we may see some provisions being put in place that demand some larger concessions from the Cuban government going forward. That threatens sort of the rolling back of some of the policy opening that the Obama administration pursued, but I don't think in the immediate that we're going to see immediate sort of closing down of embassies and rolling back and of diplomatic openings, or sort of what we've seen as the rapprochement since December 14th, 2000, or December 17th, 2014.
Danielle?
I would agree with that. I think, regarding the first part of the question, I think that Fidel Castro's death, although it had a huge impact in Cuba, it's not necessarily going to have an impact on, policy, right, toward the U.S. Or domestic policy, right? President Raul Castro has been there. And has been, making the decisions for the country for quite a while, and we don't expect that the death of Fidel would change that in any way. As far as, what is going to happen Inauguration Day, that certainly is a different story, right? And we all have to wait and see. I mean, I would tend to agree, with the fact that we won't see anything right away. But certainly, our president-elect is quite unpredictable, so we really, can only speculate on that, I think. But as far as, policies led by, President Castro, I don't think that we'll see, much change because, his brother has passed away.
Right?
I only wish I was
Frank.
right.
They become kind of interchangeable to me,
So yeah, Cuba had entered a sort of post-Fidel period for some time. Remember that he's been out of office for 10 years. I wouldn't say he had no influence, but his influence waned as his health deteriorated. So that over the last 2 or 3 years, I don't really think that he had much influence. And in fact, I think Raul Castro did a number of things that would have been unthinkable if Fidel had been in power, such as the normalization of relations with the United States. So I don't think the passing of Fidel will have any real significant or any impact on US Cuba. I think the real impact, separate, completely separate from the passing of Fidel, is our next president, right? That's where the question, I think, is important, and as Danielle said, is very unpredictable. But let me take a different course on this, because, one should pay attention to what people say, especially when they say it repeatedly. And especially when its advisors say so, like the vice president-elect, like the chief of staff, repeatedly say so after the election, not during the campaign, but after the election. If anything, the transition has raised expectation that something big is coming. Now, what that looks like, I grant you, we don't know, and I don't think that on January 21st, President Trump will break relations with Cuba, but he has to start moving in a direction because he at least feels or perceives that he has a political debt. Let me just elaborate. I don't want to take too much time, but I'm emotional and adamant about this issue. At the end of the day, Donald Trump doesn't care about Cuba, right? He changed his mind 3 different occasions in the last 6 months, right? And as the political winds, or as he saw immediate political impact, he changed his mind so that now he has the position of reversing everything that President Obama has done. So the way I see this is that he will delegate Cuba policy to others. And he will delegate Cuba policy to largely, but not solely, to Cuban American legislators in this town, and to Senator Marco Rubio, and to Senator Menendez. Because these are individuals, I remind you, that did not support the president-elect in the election, with the exception, I think, of Mario Diaz-Balart. Right, so on an issue that he does not care about, in a sense, he will hand over this political chit to people who did not support him and say, here, you take this, run with it, but remember, in the future, I'm gonna cash in that chit on another issue, maybe in 2020 when I run again. So this is all a political calculation that has nothing to do with desired effects or policy effectiveness. It has all to do with politics. And therefore, Eduardo, and I finish here now, we are in a sense, in that context, returning to the Cold War. where Cuba was a political football that you went back and forth with, but that really, in terms of policy effectiveness, wasn't really up for debate. It was all a question of the politics of South Florida.
Okay, I'll turn it back to you, Brian, but you've introduced something which is really quite interesting. We had almost become accustomed to the notion that the Cuban American legislative bench and that Cuban Americans were no longer relevant to foreign policy making, as they had been for several decades during the Cold War. So what you're saying is that we're actually back to that now, right? So Cuban Americans are once again front and center in the making of foreign policy toward Latin America. Yes.
But I tend to agree with Frank on this. I think that there's not, well, but and it's important. I mean, right? So South Florida itself was a Democratic-leaning constituents in the election, but then again in the House you had very, you had Ileana Ros-Lehtman, Carlos Curbelo, and Mario Diaz-Balart elected back into the House. But one sort of maybe an alternative perspective is that you now have the business sector invested in Cuba in ways that they weren't before. And so now you're going to have a President Trump that has to make trade-offs, in which on one side, certainly he's going to have the voices of Washington, the establishment, those that he spoke so ardently in opposition of while he was running for the presidency, and then sort of his entrepreneurial spirit, or those on the other side sort of arguing to keep the economic space open. And he's going to be forced to make those trade-offs. And I agree with you that Cuba probably doesn't matter. It's probably low-hanging fruit within the context of sort of political discourse in Washington. But American Airlines and JetBlue and the agricultural industry and the pharmaceuticals and those that have been sort of lining up to make substantive investments in Cuba are probably going to put pressure on Trump to keep economic space open. And there may be a balance now between sort of the politics of closing that space and the economics of opening that space that Donald Trump is going to have to work through, I think, in the short term of his presidency.
Danielle, would you like to add or subtract from that?
I mean, the reason that I said in my initial comments that everything we say is speculative is because, I think either could be right? We don't necessarily know who, Trump is going to call on, or, what decisions he's going to make, when they're his decisions to make. I think that, it's quite possible that he might, turn to this hard line, group that we have, here and in Miami and outside as well, to make policy decisions. But I think, that this is also true, right? That we now have business interests, that finally have a little opening, right? And people are getting used to this idea that we are going to now, be dealing with Cuba. And so, I think that, we don't necessarily know. I think if there were any other president that were elected, that had been running, maybe we could make, more substantive statements, I think. But because we're talking about Donald Trump, it's very difficult to, really kind of predict what's going to happen. But I do certainly agree with the fact that, Cuba is not something that he really cares about. And so that's why, that's kind of furthers the idea that, we don't know what's going to happen, right? Because this is not something that he feels particularly strongly about.
Let's assume that this old adage about personnel is policy. If I were to ask you, who is advising President-elect Trump on Cuba? Who is it? And can we then decipher from that what we might see in policy?
That's an important question, Eduardo. As I said, what we can tell so far is that, in fact, the Cuban American legislators are having a significant influence. I remind folks that the Vice President-elect, when he was a member of Congress, was very close to Lincoln Diaz-Balart, right? And they had a very close personal relationship. And the Vice President-elect was very much on board with the sort of hardline policy. I think it is safe to say that the Vice President-elect will have significant influence on a number of issues and not just on, of course, on Cuba. So that's one sign. Another sign is there are three individuals who have already been appointed to transition teams. They are three Cuban Americans, one to the Treasury, another to the National Security Council, and another to the executive. Each of those individuals has always maintained a very hard line on issues of Cuba. So it seems to me, I mean, I understand what Brian is trying to suggest. This, you know, there's going to be competing interests, right? Delta and JetBlue and the cruise lines, et cetera, Google are not going to go home, oh, well, that's it, and that's the end of that, right? They're going to certainly put pressure, particularly via Republican legislators who want to see a change in you know, not a change, but keeping the policy. Danielle's right, you know, Trump is very unpredictable. But man, he had, on this issue, just like the issue of the wall, he has gone out on the ledge, right? I mean, he has been very clear and consistent when he has never been quite clear or consistent on a lot of issues. He's been clear and consistent and committed, and has, in a sense, given his surrogates and others a lot of flexibility to say the things they've already said. Listen, when the chief of staff says, the incoming chief of staff says on Fox News, when asked, will the president-elect reverse, he says, we will do that. You know, I know politicians go back on promises made in the campaign, absolutely. But the campaign ended, right? And we are now in the transition. And to hear them say even more insistently than they did during the campaign is, you know, a little political risky, especially when we come to this constituency here, right? And the expectations from Diaz-Balart and Marco Rubio and et cetera. I understand the dilemma he's in. And the choice is whether he will pick politics over economics. On the issue of Cuba, I'm ready to be wrong, he will pick politics. Now, how far he will go, that's a more challenging question. That's a more challenging question. Will he break diplomatic relations? I doubt it. But if he's going to show that, you know, what he says means something, he can't just be symbolic, because what's the purpose of taking some symbolic measures that will have absolutely no impact on the dynamic on the island or achieving your desired impact from a change in policy?
Okay, let me just go a little bit deeper into this, because, you know, you mentioned hard line and hard line on the politics side, right? What does that really mean? I mean, what is it that these people are advocating, and how possible is it to pursue that hard line?
Did you want to? So I mean, I think that there's two incredibly important issues that I think that our Cuban American constituency and our legislators are looking to extract. One is centers on human rights, and the other centers on democratic opening, right? Sort of, I think that if you look at, when I mentioned earlier that, you know, I don't think they're going to roll back immediately. I think that maybe they're going to put provisions in place to say, this is how we want the Cuban government to reciprocate. You know, we want to see improvements in the context of human rights, in freedoms on the island, and then we want to see sort of the more rapid progression towards free and fair elections. I think that's what our community of legislators is looking to extract in exchange for, you know, the promise of economic opportunity for the island vis-a-vis U.S. Commercial engagement. But I think that that's what it centers on. And if the Cuban government is not willing to create that space in the areas of human rights and in the areas of democratic opening, then I think that, you know, you will see an administration start to pull back a little bit and close some of that economic space up. But that's a gradual, I think that would be a gradual approach. But I think, you know, to your question, it really centers on those two things, I think, primarily.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think, you know, historically there's always been a push and pull with the issue of human rights and political prisoners, right? you know, there have been moments where, you know, political prisoners have been released, some political prisoners have been released, right, in response to, you know, this kind of dialogue. But, you know, at the end of the day, you know, Raul Castro is not going to say, you know, okay, you know, if you'll work with us, we're going to release all of our political prisoners, we are going to promote, you know, a multi-party, you know, system. That's not happening, right? And so, you know, the question is, what is going to happen when that doesn't happen, right? Because that's not something that, you know, President Castro is prepared to do. And we don't know if he indeed does step down in 2018. Whoever is, you know, being groomed to kind of come up and replace him, you know, we don't have any reason to believe that that person will, you know, do these, you know, take these measures either.
Right.
Frank, let me add to that. This is an important point that I've been thinking quite a bit about. One is your point about hard line and the expectations of the Cuban American community of reversal. What does reversal mean? Is it in the minds of people kind of an emotional reaction to once again having the opportunity to punish the Cuban regime? And do they know what that really means? Let me get to those 2 points. There was always a false premise, Eduardo, in the 55 years of a failed policy, that we, the United States, had something that the Cuban government wanted, that we had leverage. The truth of the matter is that we never really had leverage, right? We never really did have something that they wanted so much that they were willing to commit political suicide for, because the conditions under which you know, all these goodies would come their way is essentially political suicide. So the reaction of Fidel, who, you know, enjoyed a conflictual relationship and took full advantage of a conflictual relationship with the United States, said, keep your embargo, keep your relations, I'm going to go in this direction. Right? I think President Obama understood that and understands that. And what has been happening over the last 2 years is we have been in an effort to obtain leverage by enhancing our economic relations with Cuba. Okay? So now, paradoxically, we now have more influence. Not enough influence for them to commit political suicide, but we have more influence. And now we're talking about reversal, right? We're talking about the default mode in which the Cuban regime feels quite comfortable in. They know the script, they know how to play that game, and they're gonna hunker down and wait to see what President Trump does. The second part of this, Eduardo, is, okay, everyone's getting emotional, not everyone, I mean, there's a sector of this, there's emotional, we're gonna punish, freedom is coming to Cuba, right? Okay, so what does that mean? What it means is if Cuba, for example, is returned to the list of state-sponsored terrorists, what that means that overnight, all financial transactions end with Cuba. And then you have to go and work through the Department of Treasury and OFAC to ask for special permission to engage in any financial transaction with Cuba. That means the airline's gone, all these financial transactions and infrastructure that had been built over that all ends immediately. What about, I asked the Cuban American community, what about remittances, right? These are all things that we are doing to help and empower the Cuban people, right? There is this false thing that somehow we gave everything and got nothing in return. Ladies and gentlemen, the policy change was never about a negotiation with the Cuban government. It was about what we do to the Cuban government by engaging the Cuban society, right? How can anyone be against Google striking a deal with the Cuban government that would allow Cubans to receive more information and communicate with each other better? And President Trump is going to come in and say, Google, step back. That doesn't make any sense to me, right? So once you start pulling the thread of hardline, of returning to that, I think people need to think closely about what that means for this community who is trying to engage and help family and friends in Cuba.
Thank you. He said he was a little passionate about this. So, Brian, or Daniel first.
I'd also like to add to that also what is that going to do on the island, right? Because it's not only about the communities here, right? So Fidel and Raul have historically, right, and you said this, this is their card to play, right? They've played it for years. Have historically used this embargo, right, to blame all of the economic woes in Cuba, on us, right, on the United States. And, if we then begin to pull back, right, and if we then go back to our hardline status, they will then go back to their hardline status, right? And, we won't have that opportunity to, really think about how this is changing public opinion, right, in Cuba. Right, the flow of information, right, the increased, opportunity, that's not going to have any impact there either, right? And it's important to, note that, as we, restore diplomatic relations, that also has an effect on public opinion on the island, right? And that's really what we care about if we really care about a democratic transition, right? If we really care about any kind of, movement, on the island, we care about public opinion in Cuba. And we have to make sure that, we know that if we pull back, right, then that hurts us also as far as public opinion is concerned there.
It's exactly the point I wanted to make, is that by essentially, we essentially took the United States out of Cuba's political narrative as the antagonist in the story. Not for the current generation in power, not for the generation that's going to inherit power, but sort of those future generations that's going to emerge. I mean, Cuba's, in the revolution, sort of the United States was the antagonist. We were the enemy. By simply removing ourselves from that equation, I think the idea was that future generations will reconcile the fact that, that they have their own internal issues that they have to deal with.
We are going to be addressing, and I'll get to you in just a second, okay? I'm going to open it up in a minute. Let me just ask the following follow-up to all three of you, and then I want to transition into the broader realm. Clearly, we're going to see an impact on Miami as well. And so one of the key policy dimensions of US Cuba policy over the last 50 years has been the Cuban Adjustment Act. Given the centrality of the Cuban bench in Washington, and given what Professor Mora has said, the centrality of this Cuban bench to to the new Cuba policy, how does the Cuban Adjustment Act then fit into this? Right? And what is the impact of that?
So, as many of you may know, Carlos Curbelo on the House side and Marco Rubio on the Senate side have presented legislation to deal with this issue of the Cuban Adjustment Act. Well, there hasn't been much discussion actually though in this community because it got drowned out by the change in policy. But now, with a Republican in the White House and the Republicans control of both sides of the Congress, this issue is bound to come up. As I understand here, don't quote me, but it has over 100 sponsors in the House side. What does this legislation do, as I understand it? So it's a little contradictory, but as I understand it, what Carlos Curbelo is trying to deal with is the issue of the benefits that are associated with Cubans once they arrive in the United States. Sort of benefits and privileges that really are not offered to any immigrant community or group that comes into this country. And what he and Senator Rubio want to do is to eliminate that side, right? But not necessarily the Cuban Adjustment Act per se as it was written in 1966, I think it was. So that it still it will allow Cubans' refugee status to be adjusted, but it doesn't offer them the other side that came with another piece of legislation after that gives them certain of those benefits. Because the argument here is that it creates an incentive for Cubans to come, not because they want to come to the United States, but because it gives them all these benefits that they often use to then to go back to Cuba and all kinds of things. I think, that legislation will have more traction. I don't know how it will move forward. After all, remember that immigration is going to be an important issue in this new administration. Will the Cuba issue fit into the broader immigration debate? And that's hard to know, but I think that's where we stand with that.
Okay. Anybody else want to add something to that?
I mean, just that, we are already seeing kind of anticipation, right, of those changes with all of the migration that's coming, in the past year or so, once diplomatic relations were restored. And so I think that, again, on the Cuban side, that this is something that's going to be considered.
Okay, let me take go ahead.
Just because I want to clearly, point it out, one of the provisions, I think that you may be referencing the wet foot, dry foot provision, for example. There is a lot of discussion, I think, to sort of roll that provision back. It's sort of difficult because on one end, the Republicans are arguing, sort of the acceptance of Syrian refugees in the United States, but on the other end, sort of they have provisions within the Cuban Adjustment Act that allows Cubans to come into the country. And you've heard, Cuban American legislators start raising the issue of maybe rolling back the provision of wet foot, dry foot. So that may be something that's, I think, going to be on the table in the near term, particularly as Frank points out, rightfully so, that immigration is going to be, I think, a key issue in the next administration.
Right. Let me take now 3 questions from the audience. Okay, from our guests here today, and I know I already saw one hand in the back. So, and I think you have a UCLA shirt, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll allow that here. So, but be brief so we can capture about 3 questions, and then we can get back to our panel. Okay.
My question is very simple.
And would you tell us who you are? It's always good.
My
to
name is
hear.
Dale DeYoung. I'm in the PhD program in the Management IB division at the
Great.
College
Welcome.
of Business here. And my question is quite simple. The Cuban poll that you presented a while back, a month or so ago, I attended, and it showed a change in the community here in South Florida towards Cuba and the policies there. And I'm just wondering, when you're talking about the hard line, is it really representative anymore of the South Florida Cuban community?
Okay. Let's take another question. Dr. Arras here. Okay.
Yes, good morning.
Give us your name again.
Yes, my name is Astrid Arras, and I teach in the Department of Politics and International Relations with my wonderful colleague here.
Me too, by the way, and Danielle too.
Yes. My question is related to what you said. It's about the hardliners, and I was puzzled by the fact that they might have a very prominent role in this future administration. And my question would be who are they? Are they working as a bloc? Is there consensus? Is there going to be division? And what will be the impact of having maybe a leader that might step up and might have expectations of maybe having a prominent role in the future elections and a contender to Trump, maybe?
Okay, and we can take one more if there is one. Okay, right back here. Yes, go ahead.
Hey, good morning. My name is Lee. I'm from the same department as Dale. And my question is, I just wonder if any of the professors can comment on the alliance succession in the Cuban government, because I think Raul said he'll step down in 2000. I'm just wondering who will take over his position. Will it be like immediate family member, or is it be like some sort of like inner within party democracy, just like the China Communist Party? So just wondering if professor can comment on that.
Okay, we answered that question on Friday, and you weren't there, so we're going to have to. No, I'm sorry. I'm sure they'll answer it as well. But so let's. Whoever wants to take on, there are 3 questions, and again, let's try to be brief so that we have.
Brief.
I can just very quickly, I mean, there is a line of succession already sort of articulated that Miguel Diaz-Canel is going to essentially assume presidency at some point in 2018. So Raul is planning to step down. One interesting observation is that there has been no declaration of stepping down as the Communist Party secretary or the head of the armed forces. Right now, Raul Castro remains the only four-star general in the country. So while he will step down, at least he says he's going to step down as the president, and Diaz-Canel is expected to take over, we're still uncertain as to who's going to take over the party and who may be taking over the armed forces and how that might work out. In terms of other successions, I think that there is some talk about, you know, the princelings, right? So the Castro's children. And so, I mean, there is another sort of layer of potential successors in the waiting. But those are sort of the immediate thinking that's going on with respect to succession in Cuba. Anybody?
Daniel?
I was gonna answer the next one.
No, that's fine, yeah, I think you can take them.
I think, you know, as far as the, you know, South Florida community, I think, yes, right, it is changing. And you might even find a majority that favors diplomatic relations with Cuba. That doesn't, however, negate the community that continues to be against diplomatic relations. And we haven't found that the legislators in the area are responding to those changes that are happening, right? So, you know, no, maybe maybe it's safe to say that they don't necessarily represent the majority, but they do have a strong community, right, that still continues to support that hard line. And so I think, you know, it remains to be seen, you know, how that might gradually change in the future. But right now, you know, they haven't necessarily officially responded to that change in any kind of policy.
Frank?
I'll address this point and then Astra's voice. This is an important question because I think the Republicans are learning the wrong lesson. Because what we hear now, all kinds of things, including that Donald Trump won Florida because of the Cuban American vote. There is absolutely, and Eduardo could say this better than that, no empirical evidence to show that. It's not my opinion, forget my opinion. There's no empirical evidence. Hillary Clinton won Miami-Dade County by 30 points. She won 81,000 votes more than Barack Obama did in 2012. Hialeah and Westchester, which are districts heavily Cuban, 75, 80%. In Hialeah, for example, Barack Obama lost that area by 6 or 7 points. This year, it was a tie, 49 to 49%. In other words, in many ways, Hillary Clinton did better than Barack Obama did with the Cuban American vote. Therefore, the Cuban American vote did not make the difference in the state. There were other reasons that we can get into as to why Hillary Clinton lost the state of Florida. So that's on one hand. I think, and again, this is important, when people, even those who voted for Donald Trump, may realize the costs of continuing to do the things they do in Cuba, whatever that may be, those things may be threatened, right? They could very well, Republicans lose even more Cuban American votes than they did in this election. Because as you indicated, as the Cuba poll indicates, trends are moving. Remember that, and this is now a exit poll, John McCain won the Cuban American vote in that landslide election won the Cuban American vote with 65% of the Cuban American vote. Donald Trump got between 52 and 54% of the Cuban American vote. Right? So the trends are moving, especially among younger Cuban Americans, moving in the direction of, let's say, engaging Cuba. But it seems like the lesson that some Republicans and the new administration is taking is that, in fact, somehow we won, or the fact that the Cuban Americans are, in fact, in favor of a hardline position. I think, politically speaking, that would be a mistake, the wrong lesson to be learned from this election, if in fact, to Astrid's question. You know, the Cuban American have not been able to have one single leader since Marcanos, right? It's been impossible, and it's been very decentralized. And in fact, as sort of a new generation of individuals emerge, I think it's becoming more diffuse. So I do not see a single individual representing the Cuban American, whether he's a political figure or not. It will be interesting, however, depending on what Donald Trump does over the next 4 years on the issue of Cuba, what Marco Rubio will do, right? What Marco Rubio will do. My impression of Marco Rubio is he shifts with the winds pretty quickly. And he's done it on immigration and a number of other issues. He's been pretty consistent on the Cuba issue. But if in fact, if Brian is right and Trump vacillates and doesn't move in the direction, he may do the hard line. Because there isn't much of a political cost doing so.
Although, interestingly, Marco didn't carry Miami-Dade County. I mean, this is the county that has all the Marco country signs, right? He didn't carry Miami-Dade County. It took the rest of the state really to help him win his reelection. So I don't know how that's going to change his sort of perception of his constituency and how that might actually shape sort of what he tackles in the Senate, which is again interesting. And if you look at the other, what we classify or what we're classifying as the hardline candidates, not overwhelming victories. I mean, you look at Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, she's had to sort of compromise, her own position within the Republican Party in order to stay competitive in her district, which is a Democratic-leaning district. And she won with a 10% margin, I think, against the candidate that she should have beaten by 20-25% if this was 5-6 years ago. So that trend is definitely changing.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to change directions entirely. Again, keeping in mind that Fidel Castro is gone, that what we've just learned about US Cuba relations, I want to now turn to what does Castro's death and the assumption of Trump mean to US Latin American, US Caribbean relations? Can we expect a different approach? And let's kind of dissect the region. And let's take the more interesting cases for a moment. What does this mean for Venezuela? What does it mean for Bolivia? What does it mean for Ecuador? What does it mean for Nicaragua, right? The ALBA countries. Can we expect a different policy? Can we expect something that's going to be dramatically different? In other words, should Evo be, shaking in his boots so that I can go home?
How long have you been waiting?
Keep waiting.
The short answer is no. Much like the death of Fidel would have limited impact on US-Cuba relations, I think the passing of Fidel would have little impact on the dynamics and what goes on in the region. Again, what is more interesting is Donald Trump entering the White House and his relationship not just with Cuba and that impact that it will have in terms of overall U.S. relations with Latin America, but how the rest of the region will react to this new president, where there's a lot of uncertainty and fear. Remember that when I seem to recall that back in 2011, 2012, the talk was that there were three issues that were getting in the way of a productive U.S.-Latin American relations. It was war on drugs, immigration, and Cuba. On each of those three issues that Latin American countries talked about at the Summit of the Americas, particularly in Cartagena, it does seem that those issues are coming back. That the new administration has a clear agenda on the issue of immigration that is of concern to Latin America. The new president has a clear agenda on the issue of Cuba. which Latin Americans are concerned about. And I think less clear, but it does seem that the new administration will have a kind of more supply side, mano dura approach to the issue of drugs and other criminal activities in the region. And so I wonder and I fear whether, in fact, we are now returning to a period that we had addressed at least over the last 4 or 5 years on the issue of Cuba, immigration, and the war on drugs, which President Obama tried to address. Are we returning to that era in which really the Latin Americans will sort of, in many ways, confront the United States on some key issues other than those 3 issues that would hurt our overall strategic relationship with Cuba? Remember, the change in policy in Cuba was not just about what the president thought it could have an impact on the island. It was a strategic move in terms of our overall policy and the impact that it would have on our relationships with the hemisphere.
And the timing of the announcement, just sort of to illustrate that, the timing of Obama's announcement was just prior to the Summit of the Americas in 2015. They sort of try to take some of the steam out of anti-American sentiment at the summit. I tend to agree with Frank. One of the other interesting things I think we have to sort of calculate is, this is a different region than it was 10 years ago. I think that the sort of failure of the Venezuelan model and sort of that no longer being sort of having the activist approach that it did maybe a decade ago, in which it was sort of kind of giving some inspiration, I guess, to other nations. And you had changes in Argentina with the election of Macri and PPK in Peru, and so I think you've had sort of a pendulum swing in the region that is a little more central, or centrist in terms of political philosophy than it was before. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that might interact with an incoming Trump administration that's going to be appearing to be somewhat opposed or diametrical to what the Obama administration was. I think it could have some negative impact to sort of our relations and standing, and maybe take us back in the wrong direction from where we were.
Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I also agree with Frank. I think as far as, Cuba is concerned, while we may be listening to, I think rhetoric that takes us back to Cold War times, right? We have a different political sentiment in Latin America and the Caribbean with respect to Cuba, right? And so there is a general support of, increased diplomacy on the U.S. end with Cuba. And so, that's something that is certainly presenting a different environment.
Yeah. But let me just kind of provoke all 3 of you, because, when I managed to get into the Russian TV, they had a very good Twitter site, and you could actually get into the video and watch the entire funeral. And as I looked in the background, what I saw were a lot of my friends, right? I mean, Evo was there, and Martin Torrijos was there, right? Leonel Hernandez was there, and the 2 former presidents of Brazil were there, and and so it looked like, there were several other leaders, but primarily representing that side. And then it also, coincided this week with Mercosur kicking out Venezuela, right? I mean, are things changing sort of kind of by the very fact that Trump has been elected?
Well, when it comes to Cuba, unfortunately, and here I'm probably going to get a little emotional as well, I think it's just absolutely disgusting. The hypocrisy of the double standard that many Latin American Democrats, let's set aside the sort of the Maduros and the Morales, that the way that they sort of accept and eulogize and have this sort of heroic kind of vision about a brutal dictator. It's fascinating to me to see how they go through these sort of mental gymnastics about criticizing right-wing dictators, but sort of thinking of Fidel as sort of this benevolent person. I mean, the hypocrisy is astounding to me, but it is the reality. It is the reality, and I do not, unfortunately, I mean this, but I do not see not just the Morales, but even the Santos and the PPKs coming out and calling out Raul Castro and the regime on the lack of human rights and democracy, et cetera, right? They are silent on this issue. They will be critical of U.S. policy, but when it comes to say, okay, now the policy has changed, Mr. President, what about the situation in human rights? They give Cuba a pass. And as I say, it's unfortunate, that will not change. And in fact, it might get worse in a Trump presidency if in fact he does decide to revert and return Cuba into that default script that they played so well from a PR standpoint vis-a-vis Latin America. And now I'm going to speculate real briefly. I think that, Raul and the Cubans aren't going to sort of sit back with their arms crossed waiting for Trump to do his thing. And as he does his thing, they have a vote in this. They will react. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're going to extract a political cost on the United States by trying to rally the region, not just around Cuba, but around, and the rhetoric, the new imperialists, et cetera, which would in the end harm our relationships with they've done it before, and I certainly see the possibility of them doing that again.
Raul's 85. He's older than Castro was when Castro handed over the reins, and so I don't see Raul lasting much longer, anyhow, in terms of sort of direct governance in Cuba. And so I wonder if that space for the region to really begin to openly criticize sort of the double standard in Cuba will happen once that transition takes place to a Diaz-Canel. Much like when you think about Chavez and the transition to Maduro, the region never went after Chavez, right? They looked at him as a darling of the region, and much like in with their fascination of Castro, sort of standing up to the United States, etc. But now they're openly criticizing Maduro, right? Because he doesn't have much to offer to the region anymore. And I wonder if that space is going to open with whomever inherits the revolution, in a very severely, painful economic and political environment in Cuba, and whether or not that's when you see the region start to react to Cuba. It's not Fidel's Cuba, it's not Raul's Cuba, it's whoever inherits or succeeds them. It's their Cuba, and it's the wrong environment, and so that's when you start to see the region begin to rally. I don't know, maybe that's the space, but I agree it's not going to happen while sort of the architects are in power.
Daniel?
Yeah, I think though that as long as the Cuban Revolution, right, remains, that it'll continue to be symbolic as an anti-US, right, anti-US imperialism, movement, right? And so, I think it's a real concern, right? Because, Raul is getting old, Fidel has passed away, right? But anti-US imperialism is immortal, right? And so I think that, it's a real concern, right? If, whatever policies, the Trump administration takes on will rally, right? That kind of sentiment, and change, right, the environment that we're looking at right now. I think we're not only talking about immigration, right, and the issues that you brought up, but I think we're also talking about, what kind of support, right, is going to be there for economic development, for investment, right? I mean, these are the things that, Latin America and the Caribbean, are most, I think, concerned with.
Frank is going to have to leave in a few minutes, and he told me about this before, so before he leaves, I don't want him to leave without going back to the firing squad, okay? So, and I maybe shouldn't use that analogy in that conversation, so sorry about that. But anyway, so let's take 3 questions, and
There's some on Facebook Live as well.
Are there?
Oh, really? We have to go to Sebastian?
Well, I guess we have to give the Sebastian.
Hi, Sebastian Arcos from the Cuban Research Institute. A question for the panel. Considering the relationship between Cuba, Latin America, and the United States, wouldn't you say that the disappearance of Fidel Castro will change in a significant way the way Latin America sees Cuba vis-a-vis the United States? It's not the same to use Cuba as the example of anti-imperialist country. Now that Fidel Castro is gone, Raúl is the Maduro case in Venezuela that Brian just pointed out. So I asked the panel to consider, doesn't this really changes the way the region will deal with the United States and Cuba now that Fidel Castro, the symbol of the Cuban Revolution, is gone?
Good question. Let me take one or two more, if there are any. If there,
Do we have Facebook?
Yeah, can I pose one from Facebook?
yes, please.
So Michael asked, which Latin American countries or leadership foster the best or most influential relationships with Cuba? And separately, how much engagement do we expect from China with or without U.S. engagement in the region?
Okay, so you want to, why don't we start with you, Brian, since you just, and then we'll,
Which question? You want me to?
any one of the questions, but I think, you know,
Well, okay, I mean, to Sebastian's point, I think, you know, I think that perhaps the death of Fidel does create some space for, you know, some changes that maybe wouldn't have occurred with Fidel alive, right, out of loyalty or out of fear or what have you. Whether that's a U.S. policy, you know, to be more emboldened, right, or on the island, and whether or not there are changes in which the political leadership on the island were apprehensive in making because Fidel was alive, or regional sort of responses to Cuba in his absence. I certainly think that there is space there, because as you point out, you know, Fidel wasn't just part of the revolution, he was the revolution, he was the architect of the revolution. There is a closing of the chapter, in my opinion, and I believe when history looks back, Raúl will be sort of thought of as a transition leader in Cuba, not someone who inherited the revolution. I think the revolution, you know, may close with, you know, with Fidel to some degree, much like Chavez, right, in sort of Bolivarianism. But so I think the space is there. We'll see. We're you know, it's still fresh. We'll see if the region does do that. To Michael's question, I think there's a lot of speculation that yes, a hardline approach, not just towards Cuba, but sort of a reverting back on some of the policies that made us unpopular in the region, could create space for countries like China to further, you know, sort of bolster its relationships in the region. You know, and even Chinese media is sort of reporting the same thing. I mean, they're talking about future engagement in China. And so this is a strategic, you know, competitor of the United States in terms of overall market and influence. And this is something that Washington has been, you know, kind of looking very closely at in terms of, you know, how does it address China in the Western Hemisphere? And certainly, you know, as the United States was rebuilding its relationship, it was allowing the United States to better position strategically, I think, to better compete against China in the region. But certainly a backlash against U.S. policy would be to look for alternatives, and those alternatives would be China or Russia, for example. And so I think that, you know, that could be a backlash of U.S. policy in the region, sure.
let me allow Frank to answer, because I know
My
he has to go,
apologies
so.
for having to go. You know, Sebastian, to me at least, it's hard to understand the sort of logic that the passing of Fidel will somehow change the dynamic in the relationship between Latin America and Cuba. What is it about the passing of Fidel, for example, where the Latin American countries are going to be more forceful or be more vocal on domestic issues on Cuba? I don't see that right now. Once Raúl and these historicals pass from the scene, a new generation, that's a different dynamic. We can discuss that. But at least in the short term, I see, quite frankly, continuity in how Latin Americans deal with Cuba, especially if the policy from the United States is one of returning back to aggression and hostility and confrontation. In fact, as the regime hunkers down, I think the rest of the region, and not just the Maduros or the Morales, but others will strengthen their position in support of Cuba, because in their own countries and in their constituency, this myth of the Cuban Revolution still is very much alive. And how could you, President Santos or President whoever, attack and criticize Cuba on the issue of human rights when, I'm not saying this, I'm sort of telling the story, when it is once again under attack and confrontation by the imperialists in the United States? It makes it very difficult politically for the Peña Nietos of this world to go out and criticize Cuba at a time when Cuba will be able to play, hey, we are under attack once again, come and defend us. And you know, Sebastián, that the Cubans played this game perfectly, right? They knew how to play this. And I don't see the passing of Fidel changing that in any way. In fact, it could actually strengthen support, because many people might feel that Cuba is perhaps more vulnerable than it was when Fidel was around. In terms of countries most influential in Cuba, that's an interesting question, right? Influential for what purpose, right? Is it influential in pushing Cuba towards economic reform and freedom? I don't know. But you know what country is the most influential on shaping outcomes potentially in Cuba? The United States of America, right? That is the country that will help shape, will have the greatest impact in what happens in Cuba over the next 4 years. It's not Brazil. It's not even Venezuela. It is what decisions will be made in reversing policy in Washington. Right? That will, I think, have the most influence on the island. Thank you. I apologize for having to run out.
Thanks for coming, Frank. Privileged to have you here. Thank you. Now that he's gone, we can gang up on him. And what I'd like to do is allow Danielle to continue that line of questioning, and then sort of finalize it with some other observations. So go ahead.
I think I have to disagree with you on the comparison with Raúl and Maduro, right? Because I think that Raúl has a lot more, support and represents the revolution far more than Maduro might represent, right? The movement associated with Chavez. I think that, you walk through the streets in Cuba and people are screaming "Viva Raúl," right? And it's, they mean it, right? I think that although Fidel does represent the revolution, Raúl does as well, right? And so, with that, I agree with Frank, right? We can talk about whoever succeeds, right? Raúl, I think, then we can talk about, well, what is going to be, the symbol of the revolution at that point, and how will that change, right? The way that the revolution is seen, by other countries, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean. But I think, Raúl represents the revolution, as it's, kind of, second to Fidel, but still, he is a strong symbol. I think, for the other question, I think that although, right, the United States certainly is, right, the most influential, and what will happen with this Trump administration will determine quite a bit. If there is, if we do revert back to the policies that we saw previous to the restoring of diplomatic relations, that, Latin America, I think, will be an important ally, right, for Cuba as far as economic and trade partnerships are concerned, and as far as, this kind of support we're talking about, against what a Trump presidency might mean for the entire region.
Let me just add a couple of things here, and sort of the privilege of moderating this. Not that I disagree with any of you, but I think what Frank was trying to lead us to is to saying that on the three principal policy issues of the Obama administration, the changes are going to occur, and that those changes are going to be quite dramatic. On immigration, it's going to be the wall, right? and having Mexico pay for it. And rather than, you know, than sort of backing down from it, a lot of his advisors have really held his foot to the fire on this, and they're saying, we are going to build the wall and Mexico will pay for it. We know that, you know, is a lot of campaign rhetoric, but something will have to happen on immigration, and immigration reform will have a dramatic impact on Mexico. Let's just imagine that it's not 3 million that he's promised, but let us say that just overnight there are 500,000 people sent back to Mexico, overnight. The impact on employment, the impact on whatever it is, you know, is going to be rather dramatic. More so in the Central American countries that we've been talking less about, or the Caribbean. We've also given a lot of time to the drug issue, you know, and I mean, this is unfortunately it's something that I've studied for many years, and it's an issue that in many ways, and perhaps kind of wishful thinking, right? We thought, well, finally we have a more reasonable approach to drugs. You know, we've got the Uruguay model, we've got the personal dose in several countries in Latin America, and there are now 20 states in the United States which have legalized marijuana in one form or another. So, but yet, and this is sort of, you know, just an anecdote, my consultant friends on both sides have shared with me some focus groups taken in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, and in Michigan, right, and in other states as well. And it's interesting how the immigration and the drugs issue come together. When you look at the Mexico, you know, top of mind, when people associate Mexico in those states, it's with the heroin epidemic that is occurring in the United States, which is really, I mean, it is an epidemic, and people are absolutely concerned about it. And it's not something that's, you know, you know, that we should minimize it to any extent. But the association with the Mexican mafia, right, with the different Mexican organizations is really enormous. And I was surprised by the content of this focus group data, the extent to which, especially communities affected by this, which tend to be white children, frankly, right, who are affected by the heroin epidemic, now relate the wall, right, with stopping heroin from coming into the United States. 82% of the heroin coming into the United States is coming in from Mexico. So I think that, Frank said it, but I do think that there will be a dramatic reversal on much of the progress toward a supply-side approach. And Mexico is going to be at the forefront. And then finally, I think, you know, we haven't talked about Colombia and the fact that Cuba did play a central role in the peace process in Colombia. And of course, there is now a version 2 of the peace plan that was passed by Congress, and so on. But let me ask you, Brian and Danielle, I mean, I don't know how much you know about this, but, you know, to what extent is that peace process going to be supported by President-elect Trump, given that former President Uribe appears to be a very strong Trump supporter?
I mean, that's a huge question, particularly when you have 450 on the line in congressional appropriations to Colombia every year. I'm not sure. I mean, certainly you had stronger links between the Republicans in office now and President Uribe, and Uribe has been the staunchest opposition to the peace deal. That said, it's moving forward, and I think that, you know, Colombia is a very important strategic ally of the United States. And I think that, you know, those in office today, those that were reelected in office, did play a role in helping support the continuation of the U.S.'s strategic partnership with Colombia. So I don't expect the tremendous withdrawal from supporting the Colombians moving forward. I do expect maybe some pivot in terms of the types of programming that we encourage the Colombians to move on. You may see a pivot from focusing on, you know, sort of, you know, building infrastructure and roads to tackling transnational organized crime and the BACRIM and drug traffickers. And so you may see the aperture open a little bit more, whereas the Obama administration was trying to focus almost exclusively on socioeconomic development. You're going to see a Trump administration focus, I think, a little bit more broadly on security and then encouraging sort of the Colombian military to play a prime role in addressing, I think, domestic security, vis-a-vis looking at those FARC members that don't demobilize, that don't move back into sort of society, but rather move off into, dealing in sort of criminality. So that's one, I think, change that you will see. But I don't think you're going to see a withdrawal from the United States in supporting, because at the end of the day, the Colombians, and we saw this in our focus groups, Eduardo, when we went into the field, and the Colombian government, the US government knows that the Colombian government cannot implement a peace deal without the support of the outside international community, and that international sort of support is being led largely by the United States.
Danielle, I'll give you the final word today.
I think the most important point made here is that, when we look at a Trump presidency and we look at Latin America and the Caribbean, I think the biggest thing or the biggest impact we will see is a change in policy towards supporting, economic development. I think that, there's no political cost to Trump to continue to support the peace deal. And so, I don't think that he would, try to sabotage that in any way, right? But it's very hard for me to sit here and then speculate on the Trump administration. But I think, there's no political cost to continuing, a peace deal. But I think, not only in Colombia, but, in the Caribbean, I think, what does a Trump, administration mean for economic development, socioeconomic development in the region? That I think that's a huge, as Trump would say, it's a huge deal, for the region, because it's what determines their levels of poverty, inequality, social indicators.
Right, and let's remember that it has been Republican administrations that have wanted to shut down USAID, right? They shut down USIA a long time ago, but maybe USAID will be on the chopping block and with important repercussions. Okay, well, again, I want to thank all of you for joining us. Really, what a turnout for for an exam week. So, thank you all very much. Our next round will cover the impact on Miami. So, those of you who are interested in Miami and thinking about our future in this, whatever we want to call it, in this brave new world, I encourage you to attend. I guess it's on Thursday. Thursday, 10 a.m.
Same room.
10 a.m. this Thursday, same room, same time, 10 o'clock. Okay. Thank you very much.